by them having to ensure that the Ombudsman's office can recover costs.
Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise in opposition to the Ombudsman Cost Recovery Amendment Bill. There are three areas I'll cover if time permits. First is on the issue of resourcing, because of course the bill claims very clearly in its explanatory note, despite what the previous speaker said, that this is all about resourcing the Ombudsman's office, which it claims is under-resourced. But as the previous speaker did acknowledge, since 2012, which is when this bill was actually first in the ballot, funding has increased by over 67%, from $9 million to just over $15 million, and more importantly than simply the money, it is acknowledged that the office is getting well on top of its workload, and in fact is forecast to clear the backlog, I think, a year sooner than had been projected earlier. But another point I'd like to make around that resourcing is it's a typical failing, I would argue, with Labor members, and dates back to the previous Labor administration, that they claim simply throwing more money at something is going to fix a problem. Well, it does, because if you're recovering costs, you're presumably going to use that money to do something. It is through another channel, throwing more money at a problem. They don't map out what they will do with it. They don't map out what that additional resource will deliver. They just say, give us more money, everything will be fine. Well, we saw that when we took office in 2008. A Labor administration had just thrown money at the public service, and actually it was more money for less delivery. So actually it doesn't give a lot of confidence the way the bill claims to do something but not show how. And that is further reinforced, Mr Speaker, by the lack of policy detail, something that is also endemic in Labor private members' bills in this term. So let's see what this is going to do. It's not going to charge necessarily an agency if they're late. No, we've got no idea what it's going to do, because what it says is that the Ombudsman will determine and specify what costs can be recovered and the conditions under which they can be recovered. So the member is asking Parliament to endorse something where we don't actually know what the conditions and what the costs could be recovered, when, where, and we do certainly know from who. And that is typical them. It's typical of the way they approach their members' bills. But what the risks, the potential risks from that, Mr Speaker, is that if they set the bar, the Ombudsman sets the bar a bit low, then we could, quite frankly, and I'm certainly not going to accuse anyone of making spurious complaints to the Ombudsman, but if the bar is set a little low, we could find a lot of situations where, because presumably to undertake the investigations, they're going to want to recover the cost during the investigation, not afterwards, then we could find that costs are being recovered from agencies who ultimately that investigation finds that there was no fundamental grounds to the complaint. Now, that risks the Ombudsman then deciding that, well, in order to help protect an unfairness, potentially where agencies are being charged unreasonably, then they'll actually toughen up the criteria for permitting those complaints to be investigated. And actually, if that goes a bit far, or even equally bad, they could actually set the bar too high for the grounds to initiate the investigation. And equally, both of those risk actually, in effect, diminishing access to the services of the Ombudsman and the power that the office can actually operate under. So I'd argue, Mr Speaker, that Parliament should be determining that policy, or at least Parliament should have a very clear idea about what it is and the scope really of what the Ombudsman might be determining. Or in fact, maybe even Parliament should make the determination, but it's not there. The detail is simply not there. I don't believe that we, in good conscience, could support that. But the third point I'd make, and I think this is something that any member putting forward a member's bill is subject to, and that's how the public might perceive the motivations behind it. And I watched and listened to the sponsoring member's speech to introduce this bill, and with no pun intended, he laboured the agri-hub situation repeatedly through that 10 minutes. And I have to wonder, Mr Speaker, if the public viewing that speech and looking at this may well form an opinion of their own that perhaps the member is a little unhappy with the results of that investigation, the findings which fundamentally showed no deep wrongdoing or corruption, but the member was unhappy with the findings of the investigation and believes that with just a little bit more money, The Ombudsman could have uncovered the wrongdoing and the corruption that he is so certain was there, and all he needed was a bit more money to prove it. Sir, I reject this bill and call on other members to do likewise.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable David Parker.
Actually, sir, I don't have to